A young nurse got pregnant by a homeless man she met at the clinic. Everyone laughed at her, but when a luxury CUV stopped in front of her house, they were shocked by what they saw. The clinic buzzed with its usual rhythm of organized chaos. Phones rang off the hook, patients shuffled in and out of crowded waiting rooms, and the fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead. Grace moved through it all with a practiced ease, her white sneakers squeaking softly against the lowland floor as she carried a clipboard in one hand and a tray of supplies in the other. Her shift had started hours ago, but she barely noticed the time. Every patient she saw, whether it was a crying toddler with a fever or an elderly man struggling to breathe, reminded her why she had chosen this work. "Grace," one of the nurses called out, motioning toward the front desk. Another walk-in just came in for triage. Grace nodded, adjusting her ponytail as she made her way toward the lobby. She was used to the unpredictability of working at the free clinic, where anyone and everyone could show up seeking care. But when she stepped into the waiting area, she paused. All eyes were on the man standing near the door. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a weathered face that hinted at a life full of hard lessons. His clothes were worn and dirty, his beard unkempt, and his hair matted under a knit cap. In his hands, he clutched a threadbare backpack, holding it as though it contained everything he owned. The murmur started almost immediately. "What's he doing here?" one woman whispered loudly to her companion. "I hope they don't think we're sharing a waiting room with him," another muttered, her nose wrinkling in distaste. Grace felt a familiar pang in her chest, a mixture of anger and sadness. She moved toward the man, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, can I help you?" The man's sharp blue eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of hesitation. Then, as if steeling himself, he straightened. "I need to see a doctor," he said, his voice rough but steady. Before Grace could respond, one of her colleagues approached her, expression tight with disapproval. "Grace," the other nurse whispered, her voice low but loud enough for the man to hear, "we can't just let people like this take up space in the clinic. We have other patients to think about." Grace turned to her colleague, her tone clipped. "He's a patient too, and I'll take care of him." The nurse frowned but didn't argue, walking away with a huff. Grace turned back to the man, offering him a small smile. "Come with me, let me get you checked in." She led him to an empty exam room, gesturing for him to sit on the worn-out chair. He did so reluctantly, his movement slow and deliberate as if he were bracing for judgment. "Name?" Grace asked, her pen poised over the clipboard. "Daniel," he said after a moment. "Daniel Marks." She nodded, jotting it down. "Okay, Daniel, what brings you in today?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the straps of his backpack. "I haven't been feeling right. Weak, dizzy, probably just need to eat more." But he trailed off, his voice tinged with self-deprecation. Grace softened. "We'll figure it out. Let me take your vitals first." As she worked, Daniel watched her closely, his gaze scrutinizing but not unkind. When she placed a thermometer in his ear, he spoke, his tone laced with skepticism. "Why are you doing this?" Grace glanced at him, confused. "Doing what?" "Helping me," he said bluntly. "You don't know me, and it's not like anyone else here wanted me around." Her grip on the thermometer tightened briefly before she placed it back on the tray. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply. Daniel let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "The right thing? Is that what you tell yourself so you can feel good about saving people like me?" Grace froze for a split second, the jab landing harder than she expected, but when she looked at him, she didn't see malice, just pain buried beneath layers of sarcasm and self-defense. "I help you," she said quietly but firmly, "because I want to, not because I need to prove anything to myself or anyone else." For the first time, Daniel seemed taken aback. He held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and looked away. Grace let the silence linger for a moment before continuing with her assessment. She could feel the weight of his mistrust, the walls he had built to keep the world at bay. But she also saw the flicker of vulnerability, the small crack that told her he wasn't as unreachable as he wanted to seem. As she finished, she stepped back, her clipboard in hand. We'll run some basic tests and make sure everything's okay. In the meantime, I'll get you some water and something to eat. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You don't give up, do you? She smiled faintly. Not usually. As Grace left the room, she heard Daniel mutter under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Her heart swelled slightly, a small victory in a long day of battles. She didn't know what Daniel's story was yet, but something told her it was far from over. The morning sunlight streamed through the clinic's windows, casting long golden streaks across the waiting room floor. Grace stood at the reception desk, organizing patient files, when she overheard snippets of conversation from her colleagues behind her. Why does she waste her time here? One nurse whispered to another, glancing in Grace's direction. I don't get it either, the other replied with a snide chuckle. She's smart enough to work in a real hospital, make decent money. Instead, she's stuck here cleaning up after people who can't even pay their bills. Grace kept her face neutral, her hands steady as she continued with her work. She was used to the whispers, the subtle jabs about her choice to work at the free clinic, but she had her reasons. Her mind wandered briefly to her mother, who was at home resting in the small apartment they shared. The mounting medical bills, the late-night worry, the exhaustion, it all weighed on Grace, but she refused to let it show. Her job at the clinic wasn't glamorous or lucrative, but it gave her purpose. It reminded her that even in the midst of struggle, kindness could still make a difference. The bell over the clinic door jingled, pulling Grace from her thoughts. She turned to see Daniel walking in, his shoulders hunched as he avoided the judgmental stares of the patients and staff. Back again, one of the nurses muttered under her breath. Does he even need medical help, or is he just here for a free handout? Another snickered. Grace's jaw tightened, but she ignored them, stepping forward to greet Daniel. Hi, Daniel, she said warmly. Come on back, we'll get you checked out. He hesitated, glancing around the room at the disapproving faces. You sure I'm not bothering you? You're not bothering me, Grace said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. In the exam room, Grace went through the usual routine, checking Daniel's vitals, asking about his symptoms, and jotting down notes on his chart. Your blood pressure is a little better today, she said with a small smile. Have you been eating more regularly? Daniel shrugged, his eyes flickering with discomfort. I've been trying, not always easy. Grace nodded, her tone gentle. I understand. I brought some protein bars and vitamins for you last time. Did those help? Daniel glanced away, his jaw tightening. Yeah, they helped. Thanks. You don't have to thank me, Grace said softly. Daniel looked at her, then, his sharp blue eyes searching her face. Why do you keep doing this? Grace paused, setting the stethoscope down on the counter. Doing what? Helping me, he said, his voice low. You barely know me, and I'm not exactly the kind of person most people go out of their way for. She met his gaze, her expression unwavering. Because I can see that you're trying, Daniel, and I think everyone deserves someone in their corner. His lips twitched, a faint smile threatening to appear, but never quite making it. You're too good for this place, you know. For people like me, maybe? Maybe, Grace said lightly, but I think this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Daniel's visits became more frequent over the next few weeks. And Grace began to notice things about him that others overlooked. He spoke with a certain precision, choosing his words carefully, as if he were used to commanding attention, and while his clothes were worn, there was a neatness to him. A sense of pride he refused to let go of no matter how dire his circumstances. One day, as Grace brought him a fresh prescription and a bag of groceries she had purchased herself, Daniel finally opened up. You don't have to keep doing this, you know, he said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and guilt. I know, Grace replied, handing him the bag, but I want to. He hesitated, then sighed. I wasn't always like this. Grace sat down across from him, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. I used to have a life, a good one, a career, a family, a house with a view of the bay, and then it all fell apart. What happened? She asked gently. He looked down at his hands, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. I trusted the wrong people, lost everything in a bad deal, and when things got hard, the people I thought cared about me disappeared. It's funny how quickly people forget you when you're not useful to them anymore. Grace's chest tightened as she listened. I'm sorry, Daniel. That must have been incredibly hard. He nodded, his jaw clenching. It was, but you don't need to feel sorry for me, Grace. I don't need pity. It's not pity, she said softly, it's compassion. For a moment, Daniel said nothing, then he let out a small bitter laugh. You're different, Grace. I don't know why, but you are. Grace smiled faintly. Maybe I just see something in you that you've forgotten about yourself. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost, hope. But outside the exam room, the whispers among her colleagues continued, and Grace, though steadfast in her belief in Daniel, couldn't help but wonder how long she could shoulder the judgment of others while trying to help a man who refused to let anyone fully in. The sharp sound of laughter echoed down the dimly lit alleyway, mingling with the distant hum of traffic. Grace clutched her grocery bag tighter as she quickened her pace. It was late, and the streets weren't the safest at this hour. Just as she turned the corner, her heart froze. A group of teenagers surrounded someone, their jeers and taunts ringing out. In the middle of the circle, slumped on the ground, was Daniel. Leave him alone, Grace shouted, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her chest. The teenagers turned to her, momentarily startled. One of them sneered. What's it to you, lady? I said leave them alone, Grace repeated, stepping closer, her eyes burning with anger as she met their gazes. Or, do you want me to call the police? That was enough to make them scatter, their mocking laughter fading as they disappeared into the night. Grace dropped to her knees beside Daniel, her hands hovering uncertainly. His lip was split, and a bruise was forming on his cheek. Daniel, she said softly, her voice trembling, are you okay? He blinked up at her, his sharp blue eyes dulled by exhaustion. I've been better, he muttered, trying to push himself up. Don't move, Grace said, her tone firm. I'm taking you home. Back at her apartment, Grace guided Daniel to the couch. He winced as he sat, the motion pulling at his bruised ribs. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly, watching as she rummaged through her first aid kit. I wasn't going to leave you out there, Grace replied, kneeling in front of him. She gently dabbed at the cut on his lip with a damp cloth, her touch careful but determined. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. You have a habit of saving me, don't you? Grace paused, meeting his gaze. Someone has to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room shifted, growing heavier, but not unpleasantly so. Why were you out there? Grace asked finally. Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. I was looking for work, he admitted. Nothing official, just odd jobs, but I guess I didn't look desperate enough for people to bother hiring me. Grace frowned, her heart aching at his words. You don't have to do this alone, Daniel. Yes, I do, he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. You think I want to be a burden? I've already lost everything, my career, my family. The last thing I need is to be someone's charity case. It's not charity, Grace said firmly. It's compassion. There's a difference. Daniel shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. You don't get it, Grace. I wasn't always like this. I used to have a life, a good one. Then tell me, she said softly. Help me understand. He hesitated, the walls he had built around himself faltering. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging. I was a businessman, he began. I started my own company from scratch, worked my way up, made deals, built something I was proud of, but then I got too trusting. I let the wrong people in, and they ruined me, stole everything I'd worked for. Grace listened intently, her heart breaking as he continued. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident. His voice cracked and he looked away, his jaw tightening. After that, it didn't matter anymore. None of it did. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she blinked them back. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. He let out a shaky breath, his gaze returning to hers. It's why I don't tell people about my past. They either pity me or look at me like I'm a failure. I can't stand it. Grace reached out her hand, resting lightly on his. I don't think you're a failure, Daniel. I think you're stronger than you realize. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any hint of insincerity. When he found none, he gave her a small, almost vulnerable smile. Thanks, he said softly. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of clinking metal outside. She peered through the window and saw Daniel crouched beside her old car, tools spread out around him. What are you doing? She asked as she stepped outside, pulling her jacket tighter against the morning chill. Fixing your car, he replied without looking up. Grace frowned. You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted, glancing at her. It's the least I can do. Despite her protests, Daniel spent the next 2 hours tuning the engine, tightening bolts, and even replacing a worn-out belt. When he finally wiped his hands on a rag and stood, he grinned. Try it now, he said, stepping back. Grace slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, smoother than it had sounded in months. She looked at Daniel in astonishment. How did you? Old hobby, he said with a shrug, his grin widening. Grace stepped out of the car, her chest swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Daniel. This means so much to me. It's nothing, he said, but his tone was softer, almost shy. As they stood there, the sunlight casting a warm glow over them, Grace felt a shift in the air. The connection between them, once tentative and fragile, now felt solid and undeniable. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner in Grace's small kitchen, the walls they had both built around their hearts came crashing down. The laughter, the lingering glances, the quiet moments of vulnerability, it all culminated in a kiss that neither of them saw coming but couldn't resist. And that night, in the quiet sanctuary of her home, they found solace in each other's arms, their hearts beating as one. For the first time in years, the morning started like any other. Grace sat at her kitchen,